David is a longtime bilingual civil rights lawyer who brings a lifetime of dedication to justice and equity, and nearly 2 decades worth of litigation experience to TLDEF's work. He has led teams challenging discrimination against transgender people and restrictions on reproductive rights in state and federal courts, including the United States Supreme Court. He currently oversees TLDEF's rapidly growing legal team. As TLDEF's legal director, he won the first decision striking down a coverage ban for transgender healthcare anywhere in the South, and brought a suit in the New York courts that led to the adoption of the nation's strongest policy for protecting the rights of transgender people in jail. Before coming to TLDEF, he was a co-founder of the Lawyering Project, an organization dedicated to advancing reproductive healthcare access through an intersectional approach to challenging state-imposed restrictions on abortion and other care. He has also served as an attorney with the Center for Reproductive Rights and practiced with the firm of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton before becoming a lawyer. He was an LGBTQ activist and human rights grant maker in Latin America. David graduated from the University of Michigan Law School and Pomona, and we are so very lucky to have him. Thank you for being here. David Brown, everyone.
Thanks, Ash. That's very kind of you. Let's see, I'm going to need the clicker thing, right? Awesome. Howdy, y'all. Can y'all hear me? Awesome. This room is enormous, so fill in. Thank you, Ash, for that lovely introduction, and thanks to Mitchell Hamlin Law School and Justice Health for having me here today. So, like everyone said, I'm David Brown. I'm the legal director of the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, which is an organization that does exactly what its name says it does. And I am from Texas, but I talk a little faster than most Texans. So I will ask you 2 things. One is, if anyone has any questions during any part of this presentation, please raise your hand and I'll call on you and we'll talk, right? This should be a conversation. I'm a lawyer. I have been asked, and I will give a presentation focusing on the legal fight to preserve and expand trans healthcare access. But by no means should the non-lawyers be left out of the conversation. So if anybody sort of wants me to define a term or say anything else, like just raise your hand and I'll happily talk about that. If the lawyers also have questions and want me to like dive into doctrine, I will do that. And also, like I said, I don't talk like most Texans, and so if I speak too quickly, you can raise your hand and tell me that too. So I'm going to focus on transgender healthcare, the work of my organization, TLDEF, and other organizations to expand and protect access to it. And when I say trans, I just want to make it clear what I'm talking about is sort of anybody who needs gender-affirming care, right? So that can be a wide spectrum. Some people identify as trans, some people as don't, but that's what I'm talking about, and trans is just a nice sort of one-syllable word to sum that all up. So before I begin, or sort of as I begin, I want to deepen a little bit some of the things that Ash touched on, right? Which is people talk about trans healthcare sometimes as if it were kind of a new thing, and I think some people think it's a new thing because they haven't heard about it before, and they think anything they haven't heard about it before is sort of necessarily new in the world. But as Ash was saying, you know, trans people are forever, and a world without them is unthinkable. So I want to give a couple of examples from the history of our own country that I like to start talks out with. So going back 400 years, the story of Thomas or Thomasine Hall. This is a person who was transgender at Jamestown, y'all. So this is like foundational to United States of America, right? This person, Thomas or Thomasine Hall, in the 17th century, you know, men and women had like legally assigned very different gender roles, and this person, it wasn't possible to decide whether this person should be a maid or a tobacco planter, right? Male or female. And those had sort of different, you know, legal allowances and meanings. And so eventually, they were actually brought to a court. And I'm sure in 1629, like, all the options were on the table, like the stocks, you know, who knows what. And what they decided is that this person should wear men's clothing and an apron. And I don't know whether that was a good thing for them or a bad thing for them. I don't know if the court was trying to be, you know, nice or terrible. I have no idea. But that's sort of where they disappear from history at that point. So we don't even know kind of what ultimately that meant for their life. But I just want to flag this story that they were able to reach sort of some kind of accommodation, right, in 1629 at Jamestown. So trans people have been sort of pushing for their rights, known to the whole world and achieving successes all the way back to the early 17th century. Second person I want to mention, the public universal friend. This is a person, a Quaker, who in the years after the Revolution took the ideas of the Revolution seriously, right, and said, no one has to assume a gender role that they're not comfortable with. No one has to assume a gender role at all. And they forsook their birth name, they forsook gender-specific pronouns, and became known as the public universal friend, and eventually ended up founding a sort of advanced gender open society, a town called Jerusalem outside of what is now Ithaca in the late 18th century. This is a non-binary person in the late 18th century, right? So again, foundational, taking the ideas of our republic seriously. This portrait is painted in 1800 when they were arrested for blasphemy, of all things. And some judge had the good sense to say, you know, blasphemy is not something you can be indicted for. And the public universal friend spontaneously gave a sermon in the court and walked out. So again, non-binary people have a history in this country going back to the foundation. And finally, let me add, as you so rightly mentioned, Ash, like, this country was not founded by colonists, right? People have been living here for thousands of years, and there are numerous traditions of gender that feed into our multicultural society today. So this is a photograph of one person who we might call non-binary. I don't know what they called themselves, Wewa, who was a, for lack of a better term, a sort of a cultural ambassador from Zuni, in what is now the New Mexico-Arizona border area. And they sort of undertook both male and female appearance and social roles during various times in their life, including undertaking activities like weaving, which was associated with women, pottery, which I believe was associated with men, although if I'm wrong about that, someone correct me, and eventually traveled to Washington to kind of help educate after the United States of America conquered the Southwest, nominally from Mexico, although in practice actually from the people who were living there. Wewa traveled to Washington to kind of help explain Zuni to their new, for lack of a better word, overlords. And so this is a picture of them wearing garments that were associated with women and holding a pot that they made. So this is a helpful reminder, right, that trans identity, transness, you know, goes back, you know, well before the creation of our country and is integrally woven into our history. Nothing about what I'm saying today is new, except for one little piece, which is the healthcare piece, right? So fortunately, over recent decades, as medicine has expanded and improved, we have been able to actually provide healthcare to folks who are suffering from gender dysphoria. And when we say trans healthcare, I want to just define a couple of terms. Oh, there they are. Look at that. I did not do that. I don't know who did, but okay. And I won't spend too much time on this because I feel like this is a room that we all kind of know what we're talking about. But when I use the term trans healthcare, I'm talking about healthcare for the purpose of transition to treat gender dysphoria. And I want to emphasize 2 points. One is that no form of healthcare is specifically trans, right? So when I talk about trans healthcare, I'm talking about things like hormones that people take for all kinds of reasons, right? I'm talking about things like vaginoplasty or phalloplasty, which people might get for all kinds of reasons, right? Top surgery, whatever the case may be. And none of those things are specifically trans. People can get them for all kinds of reasons. Some of those reasons are gender affirming and some are not. But even the ones that aren't specific to trans folks, right? So cis folks can also get gender affirming care. So things like, breast reconstruction, right, can be for all kinds of purposes, but some of them can be to affirm the gender of folks who are not transgender, right? And that's fine. That's great. And so that's why we at TLDEF are tending to use the term transgender care rather than things like gender affirming care, which we feel is sort of slightly different from what we are litigating about. So those are sort of the definitions of the terms that I'm going to be using. So transgender healthcare, unlike transgender status, is a development of technology, right? And it works, right? So we have recently been building a significant body of data that shows that transgender healthcare is actually effective at reducing gender dysphoria. And I'm happy to share with you kind of all that we have actually on TLDEF's website. We have a subsite called transgenderhealth.org or transhealth.org, and we actually collect kind of all of the data and just post it there, and folks can use it. There are other websites that kind of collect this data too, but especially in recent years, studies have been conducted that demonstrate that gender-affirming care works. And in even more recent years, those studies have tended to focus increasingly on youth. And so we are building a body of data that shows that it works for people who are in adolescence. And so we are defending and seeking to expand a form of healthcare that actually works quite well in treating gender dysphoria. And there's a history of progress that leads us to this point when it comes to providing successful healthcare. So in this country, the first person that we know of to receive transgender healthcare was Christine Jorgensen. Many of you have heard of her. In the 1950s, she became a blonde beauty. I don't know what that meant for people back then in the Bronx at that time, but anyway, there she is. And I think one of the interesting things to note about it is that her surgery was seen as like a medical breakthrough, right? This is something we can do to help people, just like the polio vaccine or the other kinds of things that were occurring in medicine in the 20th century, right? This was a great thing. Doctors and increasingly, interestingly enough, health insurers began to cover this kind of care. So there was not in the 1950s, at the time of Christine Jorgensen, like a debate like we see now about ought this kind of thing, does it work, ought to be covered. And then there was sort of a bit of a quiet backlash that began to develop. Sometimes health insurers would just say, well, we don't know, maybe we shouldn't be covering it, unclear. And there were, in the 1970s, a whole host of cases where trans folks said, no, this like clearly works, right? We know from examples like Christine Jorgensen and others, my health plan should cover it. And they began to go to court when their health insurers denied coverage. And again, there was kind of no legal controversy that all of these trans folks were legally right? So they were suing under laws like ERISA, they were bringing contract claims, and the courts would side in their favor. So this case here that I've covered, Davidson Vietnam from the 70s in New York State, was just sort of one example. There's a whole raft of kind of 1970s era cases where health plans were kind of not allowed to exclude transgender health care. And you can see, of course, a lot of these opinions sort of wove transphobia into them, right? There's like moral disapproval in this quote that I put up here. There's fear, but the outcome, right, is like healthcare is healthcare. And again, there was not a kind of a broad counter movement at that time. I don't want to say every trans plaintiff won. There were some very bad decisions in the 70s as well. But by and large, it was recognized that this kind of care was effective. Sorry. And there wasn't a controversy like we see today. Over ensuing decades, not only did courts protect access to transgender health care, but the governments, especially the federal government, began to pass laws that either intentionally or incidentally protected trans health access. So some of these laws were specifically aimed at ensuring access to transgender health care. Others did things like prohibit sex discrimination. And trans people rightly and correctly said, well, that includes me, right? And began to use these laws as protection. So I've listed a bunch of them here. The top four are federal anti-discrimination statutes. Title VII prohibits discrimination in employment. It applies to every employee health plan. The ADA, right, applies to most contexts of society. Title IX applies to educational institutions. And the ACA applies to most sort of healthcare scenarios, especially where there's federal money involved. So all of these laws can be read to protect trans healthcare access. And then beyond that, there are also all kinds of other laws that sort of incidentally can apply. So things like ERISA, which I mentioned earlier, the federal contractor statute prohibits discrimination, and finally at the state level, which we will be talking about, Jess and I back in the Eating a Bagel, and I will be doing a panel on Minnesota in particular. But a lot of state laws have even sort of surpassed the federal government in terms of protecting healthcare access. So there's a whole host of tools that are available to us and to other advocates when we represent transgender litigators. And we're working on sort of building those out in court right now. So I want to talk about a few examples of them. And there's Jess again. So this is actually a case brought by Gender Justice under the ACA. And were you involved in it, or was this was per you? Per you, yeah. Okay. This was the very first case in which a plaintiff brought a claim under Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. Section 1557 is the provision that prohibits. It's the anti-discrimination provision of the Affordable Care Act. So everyone who's what's called a covered entity, so anybody who receives federal funding, anybody who provides health care under the auspices of the federal government is what's called a covered entity, and they are prohibited from discriminating on the basis of sex, according to 1557. So Tovar v. Essential Health was a case right here out of Minnesota, where a health insurer refused to cover, in this case it was a member's child's transgender health care. And the parent sued and said, this health insurer receives federal funding, right, somewhere. It doesn't even matter if it's my health plan, anybody else's health plan. They receive federal funding. That makes them a covered entity. And they refuse to cover my child's transgender health care because they're trans. Right? They cover this health care as a general matter. They take away the coverage when they need it because they're trans. And that's sex discrimination. And those two arguments in Tovar v. Essential Health 5 years ago in Minnesota, is that 5? Yeah, 5 years ago right here in Minnesota, federal court agreed with them. So that becomes really a landmark case, marking the first point where trans folks are able to notch a win under 1557. I want to talk about a few cases that we ourselves, well, let me get to that in a second, sorry. I'll talk about another statute first. So the following year, the federal court in Wisconsin decided a case called Flack, which was a victory under the Medicaid statute. So in Wisconsin, right, the state Medicaid, which is kind of a federal, Medicaid, it's a federal program for poorer folks who can't afford health care to get access to health care. It's administered at the state level. And Wisconsin Medicaid excluded coverage for health care, for transgender health care. And again, Medicaid also prohibits, the Medicaid statute itself also prohibits sex discrimination in the provision of Medicaid. And so some folks sued. They won a victory under several provisions of federal law, including also the Equal Protection Clause. But the Medicaid statute is an example that I wanted to flag because, again, it's a federal statute that trans folks have access to, and it provides those two, that kind of like sex discrimination framework, right? And the court held a couple of things in this paragraph that I think are important to flag. So one that they said the medical consensus is that gender-confirming surgery is safe and effective, right? So we all know this. The court held that to be true. There's no denying it. And then secondly, there's no other kind of excuse for excluding it. Right, so typically, when a state tries to defend its trans health exclusion, it won't just say, well, this isn't sex discrimination under a matter of law, but also, you know what, it doesn't work, and it's really expensive, right? And both of those things are lies, and the court rejected both of them quite explicitly. They said no reasonable jury could conclude that cost concerns are real when you're talking about trans health care. So in other words, trans health care is not unusually expensive, right? It costs some money, but all forms of healthcare cost some money. There's nothing special about transgender healthcare that justifies excluding it from a health plan on the basis of cost. So this is a very important win. Question?
This is wonderful information. Thank you. So was this case tried in a Wisconsin court or at a national level?
So this was a federal case. So it was decided by a federal court located in Wisconsin applying federal law. The Medicaid statute applies nationwide, right? Now, the state did not appeal this case, so it's not precedent anywhere except as applied to the Medicaid statute in Wisconsin, right? No court of appeals decided this, so it's not like other courts are obliged to follow it. But we think the reasoning is very persuasive, and so it seems likely that they should, right? Okay. Yes. Oh, another question. You got it? Yeah, I got it. Oh, this is the microphone. All right. Look at us being all fancy.
Would this also bind the Office of Civil Rights in how they apply? I'm forgetting what their reporting system is, but they have an internal reporting system, and I'm wondering if this would also act as guidance.
The Office of Civil Rights within the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, or within Minnesota, or sorry, Wisconsin?
The Federal Office of Civil Rights, I believe that's administered. They handle all their HIPAA and their cases through the Midwest.
HHS. Oh, HHS. Yeah. Okay. So bind is an interesting word. There's what is the joke? Like, if you want two answers to one question, you ask one lawyer. Because it's not a Supreme Court decision or a Court of Appeals decision, it's sort of, perhaps you could say its binding effect is limited to Wisconsin, but the federal government could accept that a federal court has ruled on this issue and not try and fight it. So they ought to be following and respecting this decision. I believe the present administration is doing so. But as you can see, this case, well, sorry, as you can't see, as you used to be able to see, this case was decided in 2019. The administration was different at the time. And so I don't know kind of what positions they took. That would be perhaps something that would be itself be grounds for a lawsuit, right? And the plaintiffs might say, look, this was already decided. Okay, I'll mention just one more quick case, which is sort of the big kahuna, Bostock v. Clayton County. Right, Bostock v. Clayton County is the first Supreme Court decision applying one of these federal statutes to trans folks. So Title VII, it's an employment statute. It says you can't commit sex discrimination in the provision of employment. And in this case, the Harris Funeral Home fired Amy Stevens, who you see pictured here, because she's transgender. And the Supreme Court ruled, as you can see, that you cannot discriminate against an employee because they are trans. And the way that you test for that is if you change an employee's sex and you get a different result from what the employer would have done, that's illegal. Now, Title VII was about firing someone. So it wasn't directly about health care. But Title VII doesn't say firing. It says discriminate in employment, terms and conditions of employment. Right? So advocates like TLDEF and others are now using this case to build it out specifically in the healthcare context. And a lot of nationwide litigation is arising under Title VII in particular about employee health plans. And hopefully my next slide will get us into that. Oh, yeah, no, I got a tiny bit to go. So let me say this. This is where we are now, this graph, right? So because of these kinds of wins, because of the federal court wins that I've referred to, because of the passage of these statutes and rules that I've referred to, because of increasing knowledge that trans healthcare works, and of course because we live in a changing society, trans healthcare has become a lot more available and a lot more utilized. So some folks recently published a study looking at a database of health insurance utilization, right? And as you can see, they concluded this is a survey of essentially everybody in this country who has either private health insurance or Medicare, I think. So probably like 2/3 of the whole country, right? And they looked at data about how much they are using gender-affirming healthcare. So specifically on the left, how many people are receiving coverage for healthcare. And as you can see, that number has like more than quadrupled over the past 15 or so years. And that's because of some of these court wins and some of these statutes and rules that have passed. And then on the right hand, it shows the actual utilization of, in the study they looked at hormones. And you can see that the rates of access to hormones have really increased, and that's great, right? It means that people are sort of finally getting in a widespread way the health care that we know that works and that we know that they need. Okay. So this has generated a bit of a backlash, right? So the things that I was referring to sort of occurred up to and including about 2020. And that is where I'll talk a little bit more about what I'm up to at TLDEF and what the litigators are kind of doing in 2023. So where is this backlash coming from? So there's two motivations that I've been able to identify. One is transphobia and the other is political extremism. So I put a little article here from our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom that says, gender ideology imperils freedom. We must contend privately and publicly for the timeless truth of God's design for male and female, right? So sort of in contradiction to kind of the folks that we were talking about, 15, 20 minutes ago, right? They have the timeless truth of God's design. And this is probably the best funded organization that we are currently opposing, right? They are much, much, much larger than sort of the Lambda Legals and the TLDEFs and the ACLU LGBT Rights Project that we think of as kind of fighting for access to trans healthcare. So this is one of the groups kind of leading the fight. I would sort of file that, I think, under the transphobia side, but political extremism kind of comes in. A major kind of target in the culture wars has been abortion. Obviously, the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision marked a turning point in that fight. And one of the things that extremists have learned is that was a politically unpopular Supreme Court win, right? And so they're looking for something else to have a culture war about, and transgender people seems to have kind of landed in their sights. So we see, beginning about 3-4 years ago, and especially post-Dobbs, this huge increase in attacks on trans folks. And specifically what the strategy is they are trying to pass bills that attack trans folks in a variety of ways. And if one proves politically unpopular, they'll move on to a different way, right, until they sort of settle on one that actually works. And so an example of that is North Carolina HB 2. Y'all may remember that from about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe if I on the date. But they tried to keep trans people from using the right bathroom in North Carolina, and that was politically unpopular, right? The bill did pass, but it was a source of great controversy. There was a lawsuit. They had to kind of settle it. It didn't go over very well. So they then said, well, let's not focus on trans people as a whole. Let's focus on kids in particular. We think that's a good sort of wedge issue. And so we're seeing a lot of bills focusing on kids, on trans youth. And that's not the end point, right? Obviously, once they, if they are able to kind of win the whole trans youth fight, they'll come after everyone else. But if you're not on the list, like, you'll end up on it kind of strategy. But for now, trans youth has been a big target of legislation. And so in the past year, we saw this tremendously record number of anti-trans bills moving in legislatures. This graphic, I think I made in like June, so it's not quite complete as of the full 2023. But something like 700 trans bills moved in the states during this year's legislative session. And a lot of them were focused on youth, right? So I sort of picked some of the top themes here. And again, this is June, so slightly incomplete data, but healthcare is at the top of the list. And when you look at the healthcare bills that were moved, they tended to be focusing on youth healthcare access. So I'll talk a little bit more about one of those bills in just a second. But the other issues at this top of this list are also kind of youth focused. So schools, obviously, sports, a lot of those bills are actually about youth sports or school sports. Bathrooms, again, often focused on school bathrooms, things like documents, so attacks on birth certificate access tend to be focused on minors' ability to change birth certificates and things like that. So one example of a bill that passed was Tennessee's ban on youth health care, and this is similar to a bill that passed in, like, I think more than a dozen states. It bans all medical care for transition purposes for minors under 18. And it does so, I want to use the word ban carefully, it's focused on healthcare providers being prohibited from providing it, right? So it's a regulatory bill. And it applies to all forms of transgender healthcare. So hormone surgery, blockers. And so these are the kinds of things that we're fighting against. Yeah, that's good. Okay. So that's sort of setting the stage for where we are now. And what I want to say is that, there's a question in the back. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's certainly more than one, but the biggest, I would say, legal organization that's both pushing legislation and defending it in court is called Alliance Defending Freedom. It used to be called Americans Defending Freedom. I don't know. The name changes from, it's ADF, is like, that's been constant over the years, but the what it means changes. And I'll tell you a funny story since you've asked about them. I sue them a lot, or I'm against them a lot, and oftentimes the lawyer who's on the other side of the table for me is like changing, right? Is a different person every time I sort of have to meet with them. And I asked them about that once, and I said, what was the guy's name? Jeff, John, whatever. You've come here with a different woman, colleague every time. And he said, yeah, we can't seem to keep women. Yeah. I was like, huh. Yeah. They get married, they get pregnant, they leave. I was like, huh. Anyway, so that's ADF. All right. So where do we go from here? Setting this scene. What I want to share is like a message of hope, right? So this has been like a tough year, right, for trans folks and allies and folks who believe in a sort of better, more pluralistic society. But we are currently winning in courts. We are winning in states. I don't want to say that the next 5-10 years will be easy, right? There could be a lot of setbacks, but I also think we will ultimately win. So what I'm saying is we're winning now. Things are close, but we are winning now. There are a lot of challenges. I don't know what the sort of near term will bring, but I think in the long term, the right will prevail, as it often has through history. So first I want to talk about how we are fighting back in court. And here the message, I think, is, we are winning a lot of court cases, but ultimately we're a little bit waiting on the Supreme Court for some things, and we'll sort of see how that goes. I want to throw up a quote here from a case that is challenging one of these healthcare bans that I mentioned. This is in Florida, an administrative ban on the provision of healthcare to adolescents. And the judge in that case, in blocking the restriction, wrote an opinion where he really kind of said the silent part out loud, right? He said, this is about whether trans people exist. And ultimately, the folks who are defending this ban, right, are saying, they're saying no, they're saying being trans is a choice, they're saying they're opposed to it, and regardless of whether medical care works or not, they are against it. And people need to say that out loud, he said. People have to put up or shut up. And dog whistles ought not to be tolerated. And that kind of language, at least those of y'all who are lawyers, like for a federal judge, that is a very strongly worded opinion, right? So this is the stakes right now. This is what we are fighting about. And like I said, we are for the most part winning these cases right now. And I'll throw up a couple that TLDEF is actually working on. So one was mentioned in Ash's wonderful introduction of me. So we filed a case in 2019, Anna Lang v. Houston County, Georgia. So Sergeant Lang, there she is a, and I always get this wrong, she's a sheriff's deputy, not a deputy sheriff, in Houston County, Georgia. The health plan of Houston County, Georgia, it's a rural county, does not cover transgender health care. So she came to us and sued under Title VII, among other things. And while we were litigating the case, the Supreme Court decided Bostock. And so we said, great, Bostock, the case that I referred to earlier with Amy Stevens where she was fired because she is trans. And the Bostock was that case that said you cannot discriminate against an employee because they are trans. And we said, okay, Bostock resolves this case, right? Bostock said there is one simple test for sex discrimination, but for the employee's sex, would she have been treated differently? So here we have an employee who has a health plan that covers medically necessary surgeries, right? She needs a vaginoplasty. Vaginoplasty is covered under the plan, except for her because she was assigned male at birth. So they take that coverage away from her, right? So that is what Bostock calls its simple test. And we say, fail simple test. And the judge agreed with us. So this was now 2 years ago. We won her case. It was the first federal case, and it was the first case anywhere in the South, which was kind of cool, that said that trans health discrimination is illegal. And what's a little bit perhaps surprising about this case is that the county, which is a county that has 100,000 people in it, has continued to defend it, right? So I'm actually arguing the appeal of this case in 2 weeks in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And she's the only transgender employee. And one of the things they are continuing to argue is that this is a cost-based exclusion, right? We're not trying to discriminate against trans people. We just need to save a little bit of money. And I was like, well, could you, let's say, if you need to save money by having a round of layoffs, could you pick only women to lay off or only trans people? No, right? Obviously not. Same thing here. You can't exclude coverage for vaginoplasty just because someone needs it because they're trans. Right? So this is one of the things that we're fighting about. And I think one of the cool things about this case is that a jury awarded Sergeant Lang more than her annual salary in damages for this case, right? So not only does she get her health care, the defendants have to remove the exclusion. She's actually had her surgery since then. She got a bunch of money, and in our legal system, kind of, money stands for righting a wrong. And this is, rural Southern Georgians, rural Georgians, right, who got it. They understood that this is sex discrimination. They understood that this is harmful. And we've gotten a lot of sort of positive coverage of this case. And I wanted to, if I'm able to technically, play a little bit of a clip. So I think we have to do this. If we can just do like the last minute. I'm playing this mostly because I like a good mic drop.
Tonight, House and County.
But also because I think it sort of is emblematic of where we stand in the public's eye. So if you go to like 145.
Immoral and expensive.
Maybe like 140, sorry.
They've spent at this point
or like 135.
$1 million
against trans employees is illegal.
Yeah, here we go. Okay.
Individuals.
Lang says this is the first case of its kind in the South. Her attorney, David Brown, says the message this win sends is loud and clear. Discrimination against trans employees is illegal, immoral, and expensive.
They've spent at this point $1 million on paying their lawyers to defend this lawsuit. It's something like 50 times what their insurer told them that covering Sergeant Lang's surgery would cost them.
In one final step,
we expect the court will also enter an order prohibiting her employers, Houston County and the Houston County Sheriff's Office, from any future discrimination in their employee health plan against transgender people.
In Perry, Kalisha Moore, 13 WMAZ News.
Once the judge imposes an injunction, Lang's procedure would be covered. She's currently on a waiting list for the surgery in New York City.
We were unable to reach County Chairman Tommy Stolnicker for comment on why Houston County spent $1 million in legal costs instead of $20,000 on Lang's surgery.
So we are still waiting. Maybe I'll find out next month. So I think this case is emblematic of two things. One is it's TLDEF's fight, it's the trans rights movement's fight, it's trans people's fight for equality under Title VII specifically. And then secondly, I think it's emblematic of sort of changing public opinion, even in places that are not necessarily understood to be as trans friendly as other parts of this country. I want to give a second example of a case that I'm working on, that TLDEF is working on, Cadle v. Falwell. So this is our lawsuit against the entire state of North Carolina about their employee health plan. And Dale Falwell is the treasurer of the state of North Carolina. And what's interesting there is that before he took office, the state had a trans health exclusion in its employee health plan and removed it. And he put it back. And he said, I can't remember the quote. He said, I will not cover trans health care unless a federal court tells me that I have to. So we arranged that for him. And last year, just a week after the Anna Lang's decision in the Falwell case, the Middle District of North Carolina, so the federal court there, ruled that an exclusion facially discriminates based on sex and transgender status in an employee health plan like that. So two things about that. One is this was a cool week for me, like I got like 2 decisions back to back. But secondly, that word facial, right, some of you lawyers again may know this, right, what that means is that trans people don't have to prove anything, right? It's there in black and white on the page. When you exclude health care coverage from your health plan because it is trans health care, right, the case is done. You've lost, right? You have violated Title VII. We also won this case a few weeks later. Again, the court issued a supplementary opinion under the ACA. So that, again, that's the Federal Care Act has a provision that prohibits sex discrimination. And the court said the same reasoning that applies to Title VII under Bostock also applies to the ACA. So what that means is every health plan in the country, every hospital in the country, every healthcare provider in the country, as long as they receive federal funding, following this logic, would be obliged to cover trans healthcare. So this decision is also on appeal. North Carolina argued it. We argued it, I guess, in Richmond last month, along with an exclusion out of, I want to say West Virginia, which was not my case. And so we're waiting on a decision there. Okay. So before I get to Brantley Rutledge, so what I'll say is that these two cases also show a pattern, right, which is that things are sort of burbling up toward the Supreme Court. So we're going to have a decision out of the 11th Circuit. We have a decision out of the 4th Circuit. And these are just on the questions of coverage for trans health care under an employee health plan. So ultimately, we will, it seems likely, right, that the Supreme Court will kind of take one of these cases and issue an ultimate decision. I also want to talk about these bans on youth health care, like I mentioned, Tennessee passed and a number of other states passed. So these bans are a little different. They're not about coverage, right? They're actually about the provision of care. So typically it's a regulation of healthcare providers, although in the most extreme cases it actually establishes a criminal law. So one of the first states to pass one of these things a few years ago was, like maybe 3 years ago at this point, was Arkansas, excuse me. And in a case called Brandt v. Rutledge, it was challenged, and the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is, let's say, not known for its liberality, preliminarily enjoined that law. And it said, just like we saw with the Lang and the Cato cases, right, it is sex discrimination to prohibit a minor of one sex from doing something that is allowed for a minor of the other sex. Very simple reasoning, right? Arkansas tried to defend the statute by saying, no, it's not about sex, it's about gender dysphoria, right? All we're doing is prohibiting gender dysphoria coverage, or treatment, I'm sorry, and that applies equally to trans girls and to trans boys. And the court didn't buy it, right? The court said that conflates the classifications drawn by the law with the state's justification for it, right? So no matter what your reasoning is, no matter what you're trying to do, as long as you are prohibiting people from getting something that others are allowed, and that distinction is drawn on the basis of what their sex is, right? You're committing sex discrimination. Very easy. So we won that case on a preliminary basis. This was not our case, but what happened was the case is continuing, and it has, I would say that the tide has like shifted a little bit. So since Brantley v. Rutledge was decided, a few other bans on healthcare for minors have been challenged, and the cases have kind of come out all over the place. And so one of the things that we TLDEF are trying to do is change the public conversation around healthcare so that we're not talking about things like minors' bodies and maybe other issues that have motivated, right, a focus on youth by our opponents. Rather, we're talking about trans healthcare working. And so we have been filing in every single one of these cases a brief, an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, that we call Trans Joy, or sometimes Trans Celebrities, if you're into that kind of thing. I do not. I don't know from celebrities, so I'm probably going to misname all of these people, and I'm sorry. But folks like Elliot Page, Miss Major, Jazz Jennings, Lily Wachowski, who I guess made The Matrix or something. Yeah. And what they talk about in this brief is they've lived accomplished lives, their lives mix the extraordinary with the ordinary, and their lives have been made richer, better, in some cases even possible, right, by transgender healthcare. And in some cases, healthcare that they've been receiving since they were adolescents, right? And we're hoping to use this as a vehicle for, changing hearts and minds, right, changing the conversation. And we've gotten some media coverage of it. It was actually cited in one of the cases recently, which was cool. But I would say, by and large, we are still facing a very mixed picture, right? So since the Brandt decision last year, two very bad decisions have come down. LW v. Scarametti in the 6th Circuit, and Eknes Tucker v. Alabama in the 11th Circuit, both of which agree, right, with the folks who say, okay, no, this isn't sex discrimination, this is simply a ban on treating gender dysphoria. And so we have to fight about that. And there is a question in the back. Yes, the brief is available on TLDEF's website. The question was, is the brief available publicly? It's available on TLDEF's website. And it is also, so that's transgenderlegal.org. And it is also typically available on the websites of every organization that brings one of these cases, right? So LW, I think, is Lambda Legal. Eknes Tucker is a lot of people. Maybe the Human Rights Campaign and some others. And you can always find it there. And so we're continuing to kind of push on this. And if one of these cases ever does get to the Supreme Court, we're also going to try to make sure that like Elliot Page's voice is there, and Lily Bukowski's voice is there, and Senator McBride's voice is there. You know, if you know of anybody else who might be interested in joining the brief, come join me after this, and we can talk. Okay, so I've only got about 10 minutes left, and I know I've covered a lot of ground, but I want to not just focus on the courts. Because, you know, TLDEF, we work mostly in the courts. Sort of all that I do is like sue people, and I wake up in the night thinking about suing people. But TLDEF and others also are active in all of the other branches of government, and I want to just sort of touch on those briefly because I think I wanted to share there like a message of sort of mixed outcomes, but also hopes. So I think the attacks that have occurred on trans folks this year and in recent years around the country have gotten a lot of attention, and they are disheartening, they are devastating, but they are a minority, right? And I think that message has been lost a little bit. So 65% of trans youth in this country live in states that are not attacking them, which is I think a statistic just to keep in mind. And what that means for us as advocates is that not only do we have to be attacking bad laws that do pass, but also we have to be defending and improving access in states where those attacks are not ongoing. It's the distinction between what we call offensive and defensive work. And again, if anyone is interested in sort of a more detailed picture of what a state looks like that is trying at least somewhat to do the right thing, come to Jess in my presentation later, and we'll be talking about the specific case of Minnesota. So thanks to state trans advocates, I want to say, and I think, you know, unlike national organizations like mine and others who are fighting in court primarily, advocacy work at the legislative arena is typically done by advocates in states, right? And so the Transgender Education Network of Texas, for example, the Gender Justice here in Minnesota, I mean, others have ensured that states are passing good legislation that ensures protection for trans healthcare access. And states have increasingly passed what we're calling sanctuary laws, right? So laws that actually protect not only people's right to access healthcare, but also people's right to travel into that state to access healthcare. And that's going to become increasingly important while we were having the fight in the bad states about whether healthcare is allowed or accessible. I also want to say that the federal government is a source of action, and this hasn't gotten a lot of coverage lately, so I kind of wanted to like bring this all to y'all's attention, right? So you may have seen that the federal legislature right now is a bit paralyzed, right? Weirdly, Mike Johnson was actually my opposing counsel in a lawsuit in Louisiana donkeys years ago. He was like on Facebook the whole time. It was bananas. But he has such good hair, right? It's like been a bit loopy the past week. There are very few federal laws that overtly discriminate against trans folks. One of the things that the sort of extremists up in Washington are trying to do is withdraw protections from trans folks where they do exist. So for example, things like inserting a ban on funding trans healthcare like in a military funding bill, right? Or there was even something about like food stamps, like in the food stamp regulations, like there's a provision that says, you know, the food stamp people should attempt to not discriminate on the basis of LGBT status, and they try to like take that out, right? So you're seeing a lot of these like very sort of minor and not covered fights, but the goal I think is to kind of establish a uniform pattern across all federal legislation that says, you know, trans folks are not protected, right? LGBT folks are not protected. take those protections away, prohibit the government from funding trans healthcare wherever streams of money are flowing. Fortunately, I think other than, what's his face, Manchin, all of the Democrats have opposed those efforts, and enough Republicans have too, for whatever their motivations may be. They want to keep the government open, perhaps, and other things. So those things have only commanded a minority of the federal Congress. But folks should sort of keep an eye on that, right? And this may be kind of one of those, like, write your congressman kind of moments, right, when these things happen. I also want to say that we are winning in the bureaucracies. And this, I think, is sort of undoubtedly true. These are quiet fights, but a lot of fights for trans healthcare access occur at the regulatory level. So both federally and in the states, we are winning, and I think that's because we are sort of masters of detail, right? The folks who are seeking to ensure trans healthcare access, like, we have nailed down administrative processes, and our opponents have not. They're too busy sort of grandstanding or who knows what. So at the federal level, TLDEF was very pleased to announce a win in a case we had against the Office of Personnel Administration, which administers the Federal Employee Health Benefit Program. That is the largest health plan in the country, covering all federal employees and their dependents. And it used to have, it's administered by a variety of health insurance companies, and essentially the health insurance companies were kind of allowed to set the rules for whether they would cover trans healthcare and to what extent. We brought a case on behalf of a trans employee, and about a year and a half into that, the government just caved, right? They just unilaterally, without even settling the case, they unilaterally issued an order saying that no insurance company could participate in the Federal Employee Health Benefit Plan unless they covered transgender healthcare. So it's a huge win. 2.5 million people now have coverage guaranteed. And yes, go ahead.
When was that?
So the caving was in like July, and then to get into the legal weeds a little bit, we were like, okay, thanks for caving. You still owe money because you discriminated. So that went on for like a few weeks, and then we finally got a settlement, and I think we announced it like in August or September. So that's on our website if you want to see it. But more importantly, if you have friends, family, loved ones, others who are federal employees, to tell them that their healthcare coverage has quite likely changed, and they may even see further changes kind of come January 1. There is rulemaking underway in. Oh, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the question was what progress have we made for incarcerated trans folks? And in Minnesota, I think Jess would probably be, and we'll be talking about that, next at our session about Minnesota specifically. But what I will say is that's part of a national movement. And one of the things we're doing at TLDEF is we are bringing a lot of cases on behalf of incarcerated trans folks, especially in jails, and saying that any jail policy that, for example, requires trans folks to be housed wrong or to be denied medical care because they are trans are unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause. And we got an initial settlement in a county in New York called Steuben County in 2021, I want to say. And they adopted what became actually the sort of nation's most progressive policy for a jail. And this county has like 12,000 people in it. And we have since been shopping it around the country, and we've been saying, if Steuben County can do this, like surely you can, like Miami, right? And so Miami adopted the policy. Binghamton, New York adopted the policy. After we settled the Binghamton case, we actually polled, there's something called the New York State Sheriff's Association, which runs sort of, I don't know exactly what they do, but we polled them, and they're all just now voluntarily doing it. Like, we don't even have to sue them. And we're not the only ones. So I know California, for example, has seen a lot of activity in this area. So actually, I think you're seeing, especially in the state and local level, so state prisons and jails, a lot of reforms to adopt policies that make sense for trans folks in custody. That's kind of a quiet but nationwide sort of sea change. And these are also influential in the healthcare space, right? Because jails, prisons are obligated by the Constitution to provide healthcare. So these wins even have precedent for healthcare access. I should also add, in a nod to colleagues, right? A lot of these cases are brought by trans people themselves without lawyers. So these are like jailhouse lawyers who are just bringing cases pro se, right, by themselves, and winning them. I would also be remiss to just not mention, right, a lot of states have passed regulations that cover healthcare access, and again, advocates are working very hard on that. So New York, for example, issued, like the insurance regulators issued something called the Department of Financial Services, right? People don't even know it regulates health insurance. Like, it sounds like banking. It sounds very boring. It is very boring. But they issued a regulation, like a Dear Colleague letter or something, sort of saying that people who provide health insurance in New York cannot deny coverage for trans healthcare, which is huge, right? At least as far as state-regulated health plans go. Colorado recently issued a regulation saying that you can't trade on the marketplace for the ACA marketplace for health plans, right, unless you cover gender-affirming care. So a lot of these kind of quiet wins are happening around the country, allowing folks to get healthcare access. A few states like Florida have gone the other way, but those are pretty rare at this point, and those are being litigated. So we'll see where that goes. So let me wrap up by just sort of saying, once again, I think we are winning the fight, but we are also kind of waiting on the Supreme Court in many ways. That is one reason why, and we'll talk about this more in the Minnesota presentation, state court litigation has become sort of so crucial at the moment. But I want to sort of combine a message of hope with an observation about what y'all can do. So I just put up a few things here. Obviously, money is important. Advocacy is important. And I think the number one thing is, get with Gender Justice, get with other organizations that are fighting at the state and local level, that are bringing the fight into communities to ensure that we have healthcare access. And you can also, if you know that your state or the federal government is like pushing a regulation that would help improve trans healthcare access, you can just go in there and comment. Every single federal state bureaucracy has a comment portal. Just Google it, right? Minnesota transgender healthcare regulation comments, and members of the public are allowed to just do this, right? And they can talk about why this is important. And then I mentioned one last one here, which is talk to your faith communities about trans issues. And I haven't mentioned that much, but we at TLDEF always try to elevate the voices of faith communities, because I think that's a message that resonates with a lot of people who maybe otherwise wouldn't be thinking about these issues. We have clients who are seeking relief from discrimination who are, for example, members of the clergy who are trans, and they can talk in court about why, from a religious perspective, equity is important. So if you are a member of a faith community, or you have family who are, we encourage everyone to talk about these issues in that community as well. I think that concludes my presentation. I work pretty close to the end of the hour, but I'm happy to take any additional questions at this point if there are any. Oh, sure, the VA piece. So that is an ongoing rulemaking. So about 2 years ago, the VA issued a call for comments from the public on updating the rule to cover military dependents completely for trans healthcare. And we are still waiting on the final rule. We are hoping it'll come out kind of any day, but it would allow dependents of folks who are veterans, who are covered under veteran healthcare plans to get access. And there's like a huge, you can see it on our website if you want, there's a huge like letter that we and the Modern Military Association and Lambda Legal and ACLU and others kind of wrote to the administration saying, here's what you have to do. So we're just waiting. Rules always take, unfortunately, far too long to get made. But I think we're cautiously optimistic that it should be coming out within weeks or months. Any other questions? One there. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Target cases about? Yeah. Yeah, yes, that's a good question. So the question is, how do we pick up cases from people facing intersectional discrimination? Is that a good summary? Okay. Yeah. So, we at TLDEF, I'll talk about my organization in particular. I won't speak for sort of the movement as a whole. My organization in particular, we do almost all of our work through state and local based groups. So pretty much every state and locality in the country, especially the ones that we are focusing on, which tend to be in the South, has organizations led by and for trans folks with disabilities, BIPOC trans folks, and so on. I am a native Spanish speaker, which sometimes is exhausting, but it means that I get to talk with folks like the Organización Latina de Trans in Texas, or others, and we do, in some sense, like we put emphasis on relationships with those organizations so that when they have problems that need a lawsuit to change the law on behalf of their constituents, like they know to come to us. So that's kind of the number one thing. And then we try to elevate those themes in our cases. So for example, the clergy member who I just told you about, Darcy Corbett, I didn't talk about her case because it has nothing to do with healthcare. But she is not only a minister, but she is disabled. And so we talk about how it's important for her to access, in this case, a corrected birth certificate, so that she can get good health care for her disability, right? Because her wrong health care, her wrong birth certificate leads to problems with health care access. So those themes are kind of woven throughout the cases. Does that answer your question? Okay. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. That's why it's incumbent on organizations like ourselves to work through, the grassroots, right? I don't have the capacity to get to know sort of individual people in tens of thousands throughout the country. So that's why I rely on groups like, BIPOC and disability-based trans-serving organizations, trans-led organizations. Do we have time for one more question?
I think we might be at time.
We're at time?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it and looking forward to talking to you all again.